The birth of Indian National Congress was an event of great significance in the history of India, and Indian National Congress was the first all India association of a permanent nature. The history of Indian National Congress is the story of rise and growth of vigorous national movements. That is why we divide the India's struggle for freedom movement into three phases. Early nationalists, also known as moderates, 1885 to 1905. Assertive nationalists, also known as extremists or radicals, 1905 to 1919. Era of Gandhi or the Gandhian era, 1919 to 1947. The reform movements, the English education and growing poverty of the people brought into limelight a new class of Indians called educated Indians, who became the political leaders of the national movement in India and led to the formation of a number of political associations from the period 1866 to 1885 and were later regarded as the precursors of the Indian National Congress. Good morning, children. Today we will study about the objectives and methods of struggle of the early nationalists. The leaders who dominated the era of early nationalism, that is 1885 to 1905, are called early nationalists or moderates. The time period of the early nationalist, 1885 to 1905. Important leaders of early nationalism were W.C. Banerjee, Rash Bihari Bose, Surendranath Banerjee, R.C. Dutt, Dadabhai Naroji, Gopalakrishna Gokhale, Justice Ranade, Subramaniam Iyer, Anand Charlu, Pandit Malviya, and so on. Now let's study about the objectives and demands of early nationalists. Constitutional reforms. The early nationalists asked for the abolition of the India Council, which was formed after the Great Uprising of 1857. They also demanded for the expansion of the legislative councils created by the Act of 1861. The central and the provincial council both should have a considerable proportion of elected members and should be given more powers. All legislative measures and financial questions, including budget, should be submitted to the council. The early nationalists also demanded for the colonial form of self-government or dominion status, that is, the self-government under the British Crown. Administrative reforms. Under the administrative reforms, the Congress demanded wider employment of Indians in the higher services, holding of the Indian Civil Service examination simultaneously both in India and England. They wanted adequate representation of the Indians in the Executive Council of the Viceroy and that of the governors. They also demanded for a complete separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary. They also asked for an increase in the powers of the local bodies and reducing official control over them. Economic reforms. Under the economic reforms, the early nationalists demanded reduction in land revenue, protection of peasants against the unjust demands of the zamindars. They demanded cheap credits for the peasants through agricultural banks, total abolition of salt tax and duty on sugar. They also demanded that the heavy tax on imported goods should be reduced and thus the government should make provisions of loans for the growth of iron, coal, paper and sugar industry. They also demanded the reduction in the expenditure of the army and the money should be spent on social services. Safeguarding the civil liberties. Under the civil liberties, the early congressmen opposed the suppression of the freedom of speech and expression and demanded rights to assemble and form associations. Now, children, under the objectives and demands of the early nationalists, if the question is asked that write the objectives or the demands of the early nationalists, randomly the points can be written from the four headings. But if the question is asked that write the constitutional reforms, then only from constitutional reforms. If administrative reform is asked, only from administrative, economic, and the civil liberties. So it has to be written according to the heading or as the question is asked. So please learn all these four demands of the early nationalists very thoroughly. Methods of struggle of the early nationalists. The early nationalists believed in constitutional means, and so they carried their agitation through petitions to high government officials, passing of resolutions, meetings in towns, cities, and countryside. They distributed the leaflets and pamphlets criticizing the government policies. They prepared memorandums for the government committees and for the submission to the committees of British government. They sent delegations of leading Indians to England so that they can have talk with the British authorities on the behalf of people of India. Contribution to the freedom struggle. Now let's study about the contribution of the nationalist movement Dadabhai Naoroji. Dadabhai Naoroji, also known as the Grand Old Man of India, was India's unofficial ambassador in England. He founded the East India Association in London in 1886. He was the first Indian to have one seat in the British House of Commons in 1892. He rendered services to the cause of India and the people of Indian origin in South Africa. It was all due to his efforts that the ICS examinations were held simultaneously both in England and India. He was the founder member of the Indian National Congress. He presided the Congress sessions in 1886, 1893, 1906. He edited Rast Gaftar and started a magazine called Dharm Marg Darshak. He wrote book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. He is famous for his drain theory, where he explained how India's wealth was being taken away to England. Surendranath Banerjee, also known as the father of Indian nationalism or rightly called as Indian Barke. He was the first to clear the ICS examination in 1869 and was appointed as the assistant magistrate of Sylhet. He founded the Indian Association in 1876. He protested against the reduction of the age limit for the ICS examination from 21 years to 19 years. He criticized the Arms and the Vernacular Press Acts. He was elected to the Kolkata Corporation in 1876. He was elected to the Bengal Legislative Council in 1894, 1896 and 1900. He also convened the Indian National Conference in 1883 and presided the Congress session in 1895 and 1902. He edited the Bengali and wrote a book called A Nation in Making. He believed in constitutional means for the attainment of India's goal and supported the Swadeshi movement. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, also known as the political guru, of Mahatma Gandhi. Gopal Krishna Gokhale presided the Congress session in 1905 at Varanasi. He edited the Sudharak, a quarterly journal. In 1904, he was awarded the title of CIE. He strongly pleaded for the reforms of legislative councils and separation of judiciary from the executive. In 1905, he established an organization called the Servants of India Society. He worked for the education of women and elevation of depressed classes. So, children, today we had studied about the early nationalists, their important leaders and time period, objectives and demands of early nationalists, the methods that they followed for their agitation, and the contribution of the important leaders to the national movement. Thank you and stay blessed.